Today's lesson, we're going to focus on looking at the first line of defense, talking about basically what do we have to protect ourselves from pathogens that are trying to get in. Okay, an important thing to note right now from what we did in a previous lesson is that pathogens are not always alive. Okay, we don't always have pathogens that are cellular by nature, right? For example, like bacteria, that's cellular. Protozoa, that's cellular. Fungi, that's cellular. But a few pathogens that are not cellular, for example, is viruses, right? Viruses are not considered to be alive, but they are still a pathogen. Another one is prions, right? Prions are misfolded proteins that can misfold other proteins when they interact with each other, and they are also not alive. So the thing to note about pathogens is that pathogens are basically anything that can potentially cause a disease. It's not just anything alive, but basically anything that can potentially cause a disease. That is the definition of a pathogen. And we've learned that pathogens can be detected using antigens, right? If we have antigens from a non-recognizable entity in our body, then we know it is something invading as a foreign cell, right? We have our own self-antigens made by major histocompatibility complexes, and they are recognized by all the cells in our body. If there are any new antigens, they will be recognized as non-self antigens, and that triggers the immune response. So the immune response is built up of a bunch of different layers, or sorry, different lines of defense. In today's lesson, we're going to focus on looking at the first line of defense and what that does. All right, let's get into it. First question. All right, read the description of the question and then try to find the pathogen that best fits that description. All right, let me zoom in. You guys can't see. Bit too much. Too little. Somewhere in the middle. Yeah, this is good. This is as good as. Okay, I'll just read it out for you guys. In early 2016, there was an outbreak of food poisoning in Victoria linked to the consumption of prepackaged lettuce. In investigations carried out by the Department of Health and Human Services, several products tested positive for the prokaryote Salmonella anadromum. It is reasonable to say that S. anadromum is a virus, a prion, an insect, or a bacterium. What is the most appropriate answer? Does everyone have an answer in their head? Anyone doesn't have an answer yet? All right, can I get everyone who says the answer is A? Raise your hands. Who says the answer is B? Raise your hands. Who says the answer is C? Raise your hands. And who thinks the answer is D? Raise your hands. Right? The answer is D. The biggest hint towards that is the prokaryote. Right? Remember, prokaryotes are simple cells. And out of these, the only one that is made up of a simple cell is a bacterium. An insect is made up of eukaryotic cells. So that's immediately out. And a virus and a prion are not made of cells. They are non-cellular pathogens. So they cancel each other out. Okay, so these are the small tips and tricks they will give in the question for you to be able to figure out what the answer is. Another possible way to tell is by the name, right? I don't expect you to know all the names of bacteria and fungi or viruses, but to tell the difference between a fungi and bacteria, all you need to do is basically go through a bunch of different bacteria and fungi names, and you can start to see there's a pattern in terms of how they name, right? Bacteria will always have Ella at the back. It's always a bacteria thing to have Ella. And there are certain traits you kind of pick up on when it comes to the names that can kind of hint you towards one or the other. With viruses, it's even more obvious because they are named kind of out of the order. They don't really get named very similarly to bacteria or fungi. With a protozoa, they can be very similar to a fungi, so that one you need to be watching out for. All right, moving on. Yeah, it's a bacterium. So next question, define the term pathogen for 1 mark. So this is where the what I said just now comes in, right? How would you define a pathogen in 1 mark? I want everyone to write down an answer and then we will have a go. Okay, so think of an answer of what you would say to define a pathogen. All right, when you're done writing the answer, can I get any volunteers? Okay, I'll get Emelinda to give me your answer.
Then that is recognized by the and that is recognized as a foreign by the
So what's give the full one again?
plus
Non-self antigen. What's the rest? All right. So essentially, to say that a pathogen is a non-self antigen would be incorrect. That's like me saying, you are your hair, because your hair is an identifying marker of you, right? But that doesn't make the hair you, right? A pathogen is a disease-causing entity, but the antigens are the markers that you can identify the pathogen using. Basically, think of it like this, right? If we're thinking of a virus, it has its capsid and the genetic material inside, and then it has surface proteins, right? These surface proteins will end up becoming antigens, right? That's what we use to identify it is whether it's a pathogen or whether it's a self, it's our own cell. But a pathogen is referring to the actual cell itself, or the actual entity itself, that disease-causing entity. So the best answer would actually be to state that a pathogen is something that can cause a disease. That's the best description of a pathogen. And then if it asks how do we identify pathogens, that's where you start to talk about antigens and self and non-self antigens. Okay? So a pathogen, simply put, is something that can cause a disease or is a causative agent of disease. So places how you can lose a mark here is that if you only state that pathogens are organisms that can cause a disease. The reason why that is wrong, can I get 10? Why is it wrong to say that a pathogen is an organism that can cause a disease? Nadia? How about Ayman? Why is it wrong for me to say a pathogen is an organism to cause a disease? Any ideas? Yeah. Any ideas? What is virus and what is prions? Are they pathogens? Are they the same as a bacteria? What's different about them? One is living, the other one is non-living. So can we use the word organism for virus or prion? No, because that's not living. Organism means living. So by using the word uh, pathogens are an organism that can cause a disease, we are basically saying that they are all alive, which is incorrect, and that's where you lose a mark. That's why their answer is so general and saying that a pathogen is just causing a disease, right? Because it's not necessarily alive, not necessarily doesn't have to be alive, and it can be also even non-living. All right. So today's lesson, we're going to focus on looking at the first line of defense part of your innate or non-specific immune system, right? So your immune system is split into two categories. One is non-specific and the other one is specific. Specific is basically like a sniper rifle aiming at one person, one type of bacteria or one type of pathogen, and trying to specifically target that. The non-specific immune system is basically targeting as many pathogens as possible, basically like a net trying to catch as many fish as possible. It is non-specific because it's not trying to stop one pathogen, it's trying to stop all the pathogens as much as it can, right? So in this lesson, you are going to basically look at the first line of defense for animals and plants, and then we're going to find out what the barriers are associated with animals and also the barriers associated with plants. So under the study design, you guys will be, it will be important for you to note the physical, chemical, and microbiota barriers that act as a preventive mechanism of pathogenic infection in animals and plants. Basically, the first line of defense in relation to animals and plants involves using barriers, and you're going to have to basically learn about these barriers. Okay, so your glossary task. So let's start with the very basics, right? So far we've learned about all these different pathogens, right? There's bacteria, there's fungi, there's uh, protozoa, and then there's, what am I missing? Fungi, protozoa, bacteria, one more alive. Worms, yeah, worms. And then we have your prions, and then we have your viruses, right? These are pathogens and they can be found everywhere. Bacteria is all over your body right now. Viruses are all over the world. Worms, prions, they're all around us at all times. So what is it we can do to make sure that we don't get any serious damage wherever we go? We have been around for many years. There's a reason why we haven't been majorly affected by these pathogens that are everywhere around us. And that's because evolution has hooked us up with a very complex immune system to deal with these complex pathogens all around us, right? Basically, uh, the right match of the right matchup between the immune system and the pathogens that are trying to get inside you and take over your body, right? So different organisms basically have different forms of immune systems that are actively working, and we basically have a very simple way of defining them is as lines of defense. And these lines of defense can either be non-specific or specific to the pathogen that's invading you. That depends on the stage of immunity, stage of the immune system that pathogen is at. If it's at the first stage of defense, sorry, first line of defense, it is still a uh, non-specific line of defense, which is not targeting a specific pathogen. It's basically like a net that's keeping out certain pathogens from getting across. If they manage to get across the first line of defense, then the second line of defense will try to hold them back. But if the pathogens are so strong, their foothold is so strong that they can even go past the second line of defense, then the immune system becomes more adaptive towards that pathogen. Since that pathogen is able to get past even the second line of defense, your body starts to break out a specific response towards that pathogen that is able to circumvent the immune system by doing an adaptive immune response, which are specific to the organism itself. So, like I said, the targeting of the pathogens start off non-specific and will build towards more specific at the last line of defense. So today we're going to mainly focus on the first line of defense, and regardless of what organism we're dealing with, whether it's plants or animals, the first line of defense, the main function is to serve as a barrier to non-specifically keep pathogens at bay. Basically, it is the first shield that pathogens have to get across to be able to even think about infecting whatever organism we have in mind, right? So the first line of defense can be different depending on the organism we're dealing with. So for example, for animals, there's three separate barriers that are going to be working in the first line of defense. But for plants, there's only two specific barriers that are at work. What we're going to do today is going to go through the animal first line of defense and the plant first line of defense and see how they differ from each other and how they can overlap in terms of their physical barriers as well. So talking about the first line of defense in animals, like I said, the purpose is a barrier to prevent pathogens from coming into our body. This is basically, when we're talking about the first line of defense, is basically how a pathogen can is prevented from getting from the outside to the inside where it's actually potentially dangerous, right? So there are a few things about our body and our features that act as a barrier to prevent pathogens from coming into our bodies. The first one is a physical barrier. This has to do with any physical barriers that prevent pathogens from actually coming in. And obviously, the most obvious one is your intact skin. Your skin being there ensures pathogens can't just get through and get into your blood, obviously. Another one is the mucus secretions and cilia in your respiratory tract. So if you've never noticed, you probably haven't noticed, but one of the things that your throat does to ensure that it doesn't get too dry is that it produces mucus, right? Yeah, it produces mucus, and there's also something known as a cilia, which is basically I can't really draw it. There's a picture of it. Let me show you guys later. These are basically structures inside your throat that ensure any dust or anything that's stuck there gets moved to your throat and is swallowed so that it gets destroyed. So that's basically preventing any unwanted pathogens from getting inside your respiratory tract towards your lungs. So it brings it out of your respiratory tract back to your throat where it's swallowed and it goes down to the stomach. So why is it going to the stomach? Is the second barrier, which is your chemical barriers. Chemicals that are involved that are going to be released by your body or by your stomach to make sure these pathogens can't get to the sensitive areas. The first one is your acidic sweat. Your sweat has a pH that is slightly lower than 7. That ensures that it is acidic. That means that when you sweat through your pores, the pathogens that are on your skin will get destroyed, or they will basically be inhibited from growing any further. But in your stomach acid, any bacteria or any microorganism that basically goes into your stomach acid will get eradicated or destroyed because of the very low pH, right? The pH of about 1 or 2. So the pH is so low that very little microorganisms can survive that kind of a acidic environment. That's why it's under chemical barriers. It deals with the two acid, uh, the two acidic environments. One is your sweat, the other one is your acidic stomach. Another few examples is that for men and women it's different, but antibacterials proteins in semen. So there's antibacterial proteins that are mixed in with the semen so that it doesn't carry pathogens from one person to the other person when sexual reproduction is occurring. And also a low pH in the vagina is also associated with keeping pathogens at bay when we are thinking about that. Another example is also lysosome, which is a specific enzyme that helps break down microorganisms, and that is found in our spit and also in our tears. So how I can help you guys remember that or think about that is that really long ago, when people get injured, you know how people say just spit on it and let it dry and it will help heal it. The reason is because there are properties in your spit, these enzymes, lysozymes, that can actually help uh, break down certain microorganisms. So it is actually based on science why they suggested that, because it was noticed that people who do that do have better outcomes, but it's not always going to work because of other things in your spit as well. So it's not always perfect. But yeah, lysozymes, which is an enzyme that can help break down microorganisms, does help break down microorganisms. Another one is also your wax in your ears having antimicrobial, antibacterial properties as well. That's also under chemical barriers. So these are all the chemical barriers that are present all throughout our external body to ensure pathogens do not get through the first line of defense. Now, the last one, microbiological barrier. This is basically the equivalent of, how to say, a new species trying to invade into a population and take over, right? The reason why I'm saying this is because your body is already a jungle of different microorganisms, right? There's bacteria, fungi, viruses all over your body, and you don't really care. You've never really noticed, right? Probably not any viruses, but definitely bacteria all over your body. So, what is a microbiological barrier? Is that any invading pathogen, any pathogen that gets stuck onto you, or someone coughs on you, or somehow you.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Oh, Zoe's not there.
Yeah.
No, Zoe's not here. Did
She's not here. I didn't see her.
Okay. No worries. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. So your body is already a breeding ground of different bacteria. So any invading pathogen must be able to outcompete for resources and for space. And that actually becomes a barrier for them as well, because there's so much bacteria already living on you. They basically have a monopoly on the resources and the space. It's hard for an invading pathogen to get a foothold on your body, right? They're basically trying to, how to put this into context? Right. Think of a jungle, right? Think of a jungle with a bunch of trees, right? Okay, think of a bunch of trees all lined up together, and then I suddenly come in and decide to plant a plant here, right? This plant will obviously have a hard time to grow because it has to compete with all the other living things that are nearby, right? In terms of resources, in terms of space, even. That's the same thing that's happening with your microbiological barrier. Your skin and any place bacteria can live without causing harm is already taken up by bacteria. They're already living there. So any pathogen that wants to jump onto your body, live on your body, will have a hard time to outcompete or outlast these native flora. So we call these as your natural flora on your body, right? So why we call it natural flora is because obviously they are uh, basically the native bacteria on your body. We call it your natural flora. And this also includes inside your gut, right? Remember, inside your small intestine, there is a microbial, you have a microbial gut where there's a lot of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi that are present in your small intestine that helps with the digestion. So any pathogen that tries to get into your body and goes through that system will realize that there is already heavy competition and heavy fighting over resources already occurring. So it's hard for them to get a foothold. Right, moving on. So we have our three lines of three barriers within our first line of defense for animals: your physical barrier, your chemical barrier, and your microbiological barrier. So let's go into detail about each barrier and what their features are, right? So when it comes to the physical barrier, like I said, it's your intact skin. So your skin basically acts as a shield, preventing any microorganisms or pathogens from getting through into the inside. That's why a cut on your skin is actually can be dangerous if not treated properly, because that's basically a canceling out of the first barrier, your physical barrier. Anytime you get a cut, your physical barrier has been compromised, and microorganisms are immediately entering into your body. Sorry, pathogens are immediately entering into your body, and that can eventually lead to them causing you to have a disease as well. Right? A second one, the second physical barrier is the mucus secretions in your respiratory tract that trap while cilia sweep it away to be destroyed in your throat. So if you're asking what cilia looks like, this is what your cilia looks like. So if you had to describe that in one word, Mary, what would you describe it as being? Mary, what would you describe this as being? Also can take it from.
Please excuse the interruption again. Just letting Year 9 students, Year 9 classes, if Year 9 students and classes could please head to the gym now for Domain Expo. Year 9 students, please take a pen with you. Thank you.
Right, what do you reckon? In one word, what would you describe that as looking like? Sure. Yeah, it's that simple, right? Your cilia are basically hair-like structures that are in your throat, and their function is to basically beat and move any particles that are stuck on it to the top of your throat, where it gets swallowed and it goes into your digestive tract to get destroyed, right? So this is one of the systems, the physical barriers that are preventing any pathogens from entering into your lungs, because that's a very sensitive spot that should never get infected that easily, right? Because your lungs are keeping you alive. So essentially, if they get infected, your own life is at risk, right? Next is your chemical barriers, and obviously the lysozyme enzyme in our tears and saliva, they can destroy bacterial walls. Your acidic sweat and your acidic stomach acid also do the same. And then you have your antibacterial characteristics of semen and earwax, and also the low pH of the vagina. So anything that is chemically keeping the pathogens at bay, right? Through an acidic environment or through antibacterial properties, solutions or compounds that have antibacterial properties, these are all going to be part of your chemical barrier. I would suggest knowing at least one feature of each barrier when you're remembering this, because they will have questions about the different barriers. So you guys need to at least mention all of the barriers and at least one description for each of them. All right. And then lastly, your microbiological barrier, that is in relation to the fact that your body is covered with bacteria and other microbes, and they will basically outcompete or outlast any other pathogens that are trying to invade your body, because they've been living there for the longest of time and they know how to outlast that. So the most important thing to note about this is that this is the first line of defense, and if you have noticed something, none of these barriers are specific to one type of pathogen. They're like a blanket defense that is meant to keep all pathogens at bay. That's why this is known as non-specific, and they basically work to target all pathogens. Only in the third line of defense does the immune system become very adaptive and specific towards the pathogen that is able to get to that stage of that line of defense. Otherwise, the others are all non-specific and just targeting any pathogens that are coming near us. Right? So we've looked at the first line of defense in animals. So let's quickly look at the first line of defense in plants. So this, like we said, the first line of defense, the main purpose is to act as a barrier to prevent pathogens from coming into the body, right? So pathogens are most dangerous where they can breed and reproduce, or they can basically spread. So basically our blood, our soft tissues, places where there's not a lot of defense or separation happening, right? So we want to keep the pathogens from those sensitive places, and that is what the first line of defense is focusing on. It wants to ensure pathogens don't get to these sensitive places, and if the first line of defense can keep it like that, that would be the best. In fact, right now, at this very moment, your body is actively using your first line of defense to protect you from countless pathogens, right? You could potentially be getting sick every day of your lives, but the first line of defense keeps you safe most of the time without you even realizing it, right? The fact that your skin is intact means that the chances of you getting sick are tremendously low, right? You get a cut, sometimes that can actually lead to you even getting sick as well. So always appreciate your first line defense. Let's talk about plants, right? So plants, they don't have it as easy as we do, right? Obviously, they can't get away from pathogens by just walking away, right? Someone is coughing next to us, we don't want to get sick, we just walk away, we're away from the pathogens. But plants don't have that luxury. In fact, they have to find very different ways of making sure pathogens can't get into their body. And they do that by focusing heavily on the first two barriers, right? They have a lot of features about them that are focused towards the first two types of barriers, which are the physical barriers and also chemical barriers that are heavily ensuring that no pathogens are entering into their body, or even if they do, they are very well controlled, ensuring that they don't get too dangerous, right? So, like I said, those that prevent entry of the pathogens. Chemical barriers are those that can prevent the growth or development of those pathogens using different chemicals, and they can even end up killing the pathogens, right? Physical is about a physical barrier preventing entry. Chemical is about chemical properties that can make sure that bacteria, sorry, that make sure that pathogens don't end up developing or growing to cause us harm. And microbial or microbial, the microbial barrier is about uh, natural flora, ensuring that they outcompete any invading pathogens. But with plants, they don't have any microbial barriers. They only have the physical and chemical. So with physical, that's the obvious ones, right? That is a thick bark. So the fact that the bark of most trees is that thick is there for a reason, right? They basically ensure pathogens can't just easily get through the sensitive parts of the tree, right? Next is waxy cuticle of leaves. That's basically making sure that the leaves of the plant or tree can be waterproof at times. Also, formation of galls to prevent the spread of an infection. That's just a feature. Presence of thorns, closing of stomata to prevent pathogen invasion during carbon dioxide uptake. So out of these physical barriers, I would prefer if you guys knew at least one or two of the features. And same with the chemical barriers. These are basically all the chemicals that plants can make to ensure that they can prevent any pathogens from invading into their body, right? And chitinases, phenols, defensins, saponins, oxalic acid, and glucanases, sorry. Right? These are all different. And again, you should at least try to remember two of them for your own memory if they ever ask a question. All right? Any questions about this one? Right? So far, what we've looked at in this chapter, we've looked at what are the ways pathogens are recognized, right? Pathogens in any cell in an immune system is recognized using antigens. There's self-antigens and non-self-antigens. Self-antigens are basically the antigens that your body, your cells use to show to the immune system that they are the same from the same body, that's from the same person. So that's to identify them as being self. That's why it's called a self antigen. A non-self antigen is basically any type of antigen that isn't made by our own body, and it will be recognized as a non-self antigen triggering an immune response. So this is most common, most inconvenient when we're doing organ and blood transfusions, because we got to make sure the antigens don't end up triggering an immune response in the other person. So you got to make sure that their antigens match or they are compatible with each other. So we looked at all the different pathogens that can be dangerous to any organism. We have cellular pathogens and non-cellular pathogens. And we looked at the first line of defense that organisms have against these pathogens. And the first line of defense, the focus is to ensure that the pathogen does not enter into the body, right? This happens that the difference, the first line of defense between animals and plants. Animals have three specific barriers that are preventing pathogens from entering inside our body in sensitive places. There's a physical barrier, which is keeping the pathogen from actually entering into the body. There's a chemical barrier, which is making sure that the pathogen cannot develop or grow, or better yet, it makes sure to kill the pathogen itself. And then there's a microbiological barrier, which is making sure that the pathogen can't get a foothold on you, on your body, by having the natural flora on your body outcompete and outlast the invading pathogen. Okay, that's for animals. For plants, there's only physical barrier and chemical barrier. Physical barrier is made up of the most important ones, I would say, is the thick bark and also the waxy cuticle of the leaves. Thick bark ensures pathogens can't get through. Waxy cuticle of leaves ensures that certain liquids, basically it's also another physical barrier that's preventing pathogens from entering in. Chemical barriers are basically all the chemicals involved that the plants are secreting to ensure that pathogens can't get a foothold on the plant itself. Any questions? That's actually about it. So